Now listen, I have collected way more old hardware than I think any normal person should. And most of it doesn't even work anymore. But some of it actually still turns on. Cool. Which should feel impressive until we realize something, and it's that most of these devices are stuck in time. That means they receive no new updates, they don't get any new patches, and there's no new protections against any new vulnerabilities. I mean, yes, technically they still work, but only in the exact same way that they did years and years and years and years ago. And being stuck in time is exactly what makes outdated hardware such an easy target for attackers. I'm not too worried about that one though.
The first question I ask when I'm powering on old hardware is, what firmware is it running and when was it last patched? I don't even think about putting it on my network until I know that it is running something up to date and secure. On top of possibly not having features that I want or need, older firmware is most likely vulnerable to a lot of more recently discovered threats, and the last thing I want is to put a piece of hardware on my network only for someone else to turn around and compromise it, or start a larger attack on my network because of a vulnerability that was actually fixed 2 years ago.
That's Jackie. Her job involves designing and securing the hardware and lab environments used to train real cybersecurity teams. And what she sees in her systems starts inside of the device itself. So to understand that, we have to zoom in on how a device like this laptop works. Because a computer isn't just one single thing. It's a stack of layers. And each layer depends on the one beneath it. So let's step inside of the layers of a device that is stuck in time, and we'll try and see what an attacker might see. A computer is like a vertical stack of instructions, with each layer handing control to the next. At the bottom is the hardware, the physical components. Right above that is the firmware, which wakes the system up. Above that is the operating system, which runs the computer. Above that are all of the apps and software that you use every day. And finally, sometimes connecting these layers are drivers, which translates instructions between operating system and hardware, whether that's hardware that's built into the computer, or plugged in, or connected like a mouse. So if you take a step back and take a look at all of this as a whole, a pattern becomes pretty clear. It's that if something low in this stack of layers has a weakness, everything above it is at risk. And that's why outdated or unsupported hardware is such a big cybersecurity problem. Let's start with firmware. This old laptop still boots up fine, but its firmware hasn't been updated in years. Now, what is firmware? Firmware is technically software, but it plays a very different role from the apps and software that you might have installed on your phone or your laptop. You see, apps and software run after the operating system starts. They live inside of the rules that the system enforces, and they can usually be removed or replaced without much trouble. Now, firmware, on the other hand, runs before the operating system ever wakes up. It lives inside of the device itself and decides how things like the hardware behaves, what the system can see, and even whether the operating system is allowed to start at all. So this laptop is currently powered off, which means that nothing is running, none of those layers that we saw earlier. Now let's turn the laptop on. And this part can vary by manufacturer, but if as the laptop is turning on and I press the F2 key, I enter the UEFI, which stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Now, you might have heard of this referred to as the BIOS before, and people often use BIOS and UEFI kind of interchangeably because they serve the same purpose. And BIOS was the older system, whereas UEFI is its modern replacement, adding features and security checks that BIOS was never designed to support. So, when people say things like, enter the BIOS, they're almost always talking about the UEFI. Anyways, history lesson aside, this screen is the interface to the firmware. You can actually check out your firmware. By the time the operating system appears on your screen, these decisions have already been made by the firmware. So that means if there's a vulnerability down at the firmware level, it stays there until the firmware gets patched. And attackers love firmware flaws because they give deep access and sometimes underneath the operating system itself.
Many things like protocol suites and patches for vulnerabilities are usually built into firmware, so by having an older firmware, you're missing all those newer, more secure options. And firmware is one of those things that a lot of people overlook unless there is an actual issue. I've seen many systems, especially networking ones, where people have said, it just works, so why would I upgrade it? And I want to just tell them to take time and read up on the things it is actually vulnerable to. Do you want someone else to see that there's an issue and that under the right circumstances, they can run commands against it that they shouldn't be able to, based on the permissions that you gave them?
Since most people never even think about firmware, it becomes one of the easiest places for attackers to hide. Just checking for firmware or UEFI updates now and then, especially on things like routers or a laptop like this, keeps this layer from falling behind. But this also means that you should only ever get your firmware updates from the official manufacturer website itself. Because there are lots of websites out there that claim to have a library of firmware updates for all sorts of devices, and it sounds so convenient. But using those third-party websites really leaves you vulnerable to serious cybersecurity problems, because a lot of them are actually hosting malware. Ask me how I know. So once the firmware finishes its job, the operating system takes over. This layer acts like the manager of the system. It controls memory, schedules processes, enforces permissions, and decides how software is allowed to interact with the hardware. And because so many things depend on it, the operating system becomes a major target for attackers, and vulnerabilities here can affect every application at once. But you have to remember, even when the operating system is fully patched, it's only as trustworthy as the layers beneath it. So, if the attackers gain control of the firmware or critical drivers, they can manipulate what the operating system sees and reports without triggering any obvious warnings. On top of the operating system lives the software that you interact with every single day. Stuff like your apps, your icons, your windows, your browsers, and that sort of stuff. Now this layer feels like the computer because it's the part that most people recognize and use directly. Software updates happen constantly, and that's usually a good sign. Updates exist because vulnerabilities are always being discovered, studied, fixed, and so on. Keeping applications and software up to date removes that entire category of known attacks before they can even become a problem. But application security is not independent, because remember, even fully patched software relies on the operating system and the layers below it to enforce boundaries and to protect it from interference.
You really need to keep up with patching your entire system. It can be a lot of work. Firmware, software, drivers, all need to be kept up to date. Any part you ignore may just be the starting point for your next security incident. Typically, when people ignore one piece, thinking that by doing just firmware or just software, they're secure, usually leaves them open to problems or attacks in ways that they are completely unprepared for.
The good news is, this layer is the easiest layer to keep healthy. Letting your operating system and your apps and your software update automatically protects you from, again, an entire category of issues long before you even notice that anything even went wrong. And then there are drivers. These are like the translators between your hardware and your operating system. So just think about times when you've plugged in a USB device, whether it's a mouse or a keyboard or a webcam or some other peripheral. Your computer installs a driver so that these devices can work. The system almost always trusts these drivers, and it almost always installs them silently in the background. But unfortunately, it's that trust that makes them valuable to attackers. Because if someone manages to sneak in malicious code into a driver, or trick your system into installing a fake driver, they can gain some pretty powerful access.
I personally haven't had a lot of driver level issues, but when I have seen them, they have usually had me questioning my sanity. They seem to have manifested in abnormal behavior, and it was usually a process of elimination to come down to how well have we updated everything else, and what did we miss?
So, letting your operating system handle most driver updates automatically, or again, sticking to official manufacturer drivers, keeps this layer from becoming a hidden backdoor. So, you've updated your firmware, your operating system, your software, and your apps and your drivers. From a updates and patches standpoint, you're pretty good. Yay! But even totally updated systems can be undone by simple bad habits. For example, leaving devices unlocked and unattended, or writing passwords down on sticky notes, or plugging in random USB devices. Don't do that. Pretend like your USB port is your mouth, because you wouldn't put something that you found laying around in your mouth. So don't plug in random USB devices into your computer. Anyways, all that to say, a lot of security issues start with us as humans, our flaws, and the things that we do.
From my personal experience, almost every security issue I have encountered has had a human component. A system can be up to date with all its patches, but if it's not configured correctly or properly secured, it can easily become the starting point of your next incident. It is rarely intentional. Usually someone is in a rush, trying to get something working, and they have every intention of coming back and properly securing it later, but later never comes because something else needs their attention. This is why one of the most helpful things for me is to make sure that I take the time to fully finish a setup before releasing a device into production.
And finally, there's one more bad habit that just cuts through everything that we just talked about. Because it doesn't matter how new your device is, or how secure the firmware or drivers, or how updated all of the layers are. It's that most devices ship with a default username and password. And these are meant only for the initial setup. But if you never change them, the device is essentially wide open. But the good news is that changing default passwords is really easy, and it closes that door pretty much permanently. So remember, hardware vulnerabilities can come from all sorts of different places. And although none of these weaknesses look particularly dramatic on their own, together they create a lot of openings for attackers to look for. Fortunately though, fixing it is easy. You update your devices, you develop good habits, and you retire the ones that are too old to stay secure.
Retire. Too old. Wow, good to know how you see me.
I wasn't talking about you.
Sure, just tell the world to throw out their old hardware while I'm sitting right here.
You still get updates, it's fine.
Do I? Do I really? Because emotionally, I feel discontinued.
You're not being retired, calm down.
Don't tell me to calm down. You're minimizing my problems when you say things like that to me. But maybe check for updates later, just in case.
You're right, yeah, we can do that.
And then can we stream that new show we keep talking about wanting to see?
Yeah, okay, we'll do that.
Tee-hee. And then maybe, if you're not too tired, can we stream that lo-fi girl playlist like we used to back in college?
Sure. Hey Google, stream Lo-Fi Girl playlist.
Sure, playing high-energy Norwegian death metal for toddlers.
That's not what I asked.
I know.